dive into all of my grading, and we'll get those back to you. So what I usually do is I will mark them up, right? I'll block the number if it's wrong, and I'll make it red, and I'll use Word's comment function to instruct you on what the right answer was, right? Yeah.
Do you care about complete sentences?
No.
Or if you want to listen?
I do not care about complete sentences. On the midterm, yes, but here on the worksheets, it can just be, if I ask you which artist, you can just say Duccio, if that was the question, right? That would be plenty. And you don't even necessarily need Duccio di Buoninsegna, right? Which I'm not even bothering with, or Giada di Bondone, right? Their full names in that case, I don't really need. Okay. The other thing is, be sure this has happened already 3 times. Be sure if you're working on Mac or if you're working on Open Office, that you save it as a Word document. Otherwise, I can't open it. Okay. So I've already said it, but please don't save them as PDFs. I can deal with that, but it's just harder to do the things I'd like to do in getting you feedback if it's a PDF. Okay. So most of your word processing things will save as .doc, right, or .docx. So make sure you do that, otherwise I can't open it. And if you don't, I'll just tell you please, right? And it takes that much longer to get it. And the other thing is, again, people are being pretty good about this, except for the people that added the class late, where they didn't hear me go on my little soapbox. But make sure you tell me what class and section you're in, and then I know where to file your work, right? Because I have 2 sections of this class, and it's going to be a bit of a juggling act, right, to make sure everybody's work is where it belongs. So you're in 202A, right? So just make sure you tell me that when you send me the email. And one last thing is that, and this came up, if you're emailing me through Canvas, that's all well and good, but Canvas apparently does not save the string of emails. So if you email me in Canvas and I email you back by responding to it, and you respond to that, it doesn't save the previous emails. Does that make sense? So if you're in that boat, that means you got to tell me what class you're in again. Does that make sense? Because I won't know otherwise. Okay? So there you are. Okay? That's all. Any other questions about so far? So you got more coming in. Next Tuesday, you've got your 3 artists, your 3 works of art that you want to do. Many people have gotten their first. Most people these days are getting their second because it's filling up between the 2 classes. The longer you wait, the less chance you have of getting 1 or 2, right? I'm allowing, I think, up to 3 or so people on an artist and up to 2 people on a single work of art, and that's over both sections, right? And the reason is that it requires library research, and you got to get your hands on some printed sources. And if everybody's doing Degas, ballet dancers, which seem to be very popular, or Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait, right? Then there's one book out there that you need. You're not going to get your hands on it, and your work will suffer. So that's why I want to stagger it out. Okay. It looks like the National Gallery will stay open as of last night, right? They reached a spending agreement for the next 14 days or something, 15 days. So up until February 8th, the National Gallery will be open. What I'm going to try and do for the class is set up a Google poll about times that you guys would be available to go to the National Gallery for a field trip. Some on the weekend, some during the week, times when I have free time in my schedule that I could fit it in, right? And if I can get, 5 or more of you that want to go, we'll do it, right? And especially, well, no, that's harder because I have a class right after this one. But we'll figure out something. We'll try to figure out times that we can go down there, because I think it's silly to sit here and do everything here if we can go down there. And if I can find a plan, we could all go. That'd be fantastic. But probably with 25 of you, that's not going to happen, right? That's just, there's too many alternate schedules, people work and so forth. Okay, as much as I'd like to, but we'll figure out times, maybe 2 different times during the week that we can set up 3 or 4 field trips through the course of the semester and get down and see some stuff live, right? Because it's worth it. And I highly recommend that you do it, because you're already paying for it, right? It's our museum. tell you a cute story. When I interviewed for this job in 2005, right? I booked a room. They booked me a room to stay one night, and I booked a room downtown to stay another night in Calorem Circle area. And because I wanted to go to the museum, and when I lived in New York, I went to grad school in New York City, and when I went, I only came down here like once, maybe twice, right? It just wasn't on my radar screen. And so I really wanted to get to the NGA and just poke around a bit, right? So I booked an extra night on my own dime. Right? I went down there and I walked around just to some things I wanted to see. Something we'll look at on Tuesday. My favorite artist in the world. We have one of his works here. The best in America, no less. So I came and I was looking around and I'm walking out, right? And the guard said, "Did you have a good time?" And I said, "You guys have got a great museum here." He goes, "No, we don't. You do. This is the nation's collection, right? It belongs to the nation." And I just sort of struck a chord in my heart. I really like that idea, right? This is our art. And so when I say us all the time, it makes it sound like I work for the NGA or something, but I don't. It's the nation's collection, right? And that's sort of a nice thing about it. So you should think about that as well as you're taking advantage of studying art history in DC, which is really a wonderful thing, given that you can go see these things in person. So enough of that. We were looking at this new realism that we see in Italian pictures around 1300. And we had been trying to explain the interest in realism from a number of different perspectives. We talked about trade with France, bringing the sort of Gothic realism that we see in French manuscripts into Italian art. We had talked about the economics of the cities and these new patrons for paintings, right? The new people who are funding it, who have different priorities than the old feudal lords, and might want a kind of art that reflects their materialistic basis of their status. And then we talked about the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and new practices in theology, new practices in the religious climate of Italian cities that might have also then led to this increase in realism. Right? And so both Giotto and Duccio, as we were talking about in class, have a slightly different approach to it. Both of them are interested in modeling the figure in 3D. Giotto's is a bit better preserved. You can see that the Duccio range of chiaroscuro and the Virgin Mary is a little washed out. Right? That happens through time. It got some more damage to it than Giotto's does, right? And we'll talk a bit more about that as to why. But if you look at the rest of the figures, you can see that indeed Duccio is equally concerned with trying to model the figures in 3 dimensions, to make it appear as if there's some space there, rather than just a flat surface, just as Giotto is. The difference is, as we were talking at the end of class on Friday, Giotto's kind of boxy, right? The faces in Giotto's figures don't look the same as Duccio's. Duccio's has porcelain-like figures, doll-like. They're dainty, you know? His hands and his arms tend to be thinner, more spindly, right? The bodies look a little bit more elongated and elegant compared to Giotto's, which are much boxier, right? I always thought when I use this analogy, they look like milk cartons, you know, with heads. And Duccio also loves lines. Look at the Virgin Mary's robe, and look at the gold hem that goes over her left shoulder on your right. And just follow that with your eye, that gold hem as it comes down, and then it's just this wonderful sort of calligraphy at the bottom of her robe. That's a total Duccio thing, right? He just loves that sort of refinement and elegance that comes through in these small details. And you don't really find that sort of thing in Giotto. Giotto's much more kind of burly, you know, and direct. And if we talk about those differences in style, even though both of them are trying to create 3 dimensions, this sort of sturdiness of Giotto versus the delicate elegance of Duccio, that's harder to account for. That's Giotto's artistic personality versus Duccio's artistic personality, right? That's temperament. That's individuality that comes through in each one of them, right? Now, at the end of class, we were looking at some of the details, the ways in which Duccio sort of augments this narrative, giving us not only the shepherds on the right who are being told to go find the virgin, even though she's right there, right? And the idea is that it's sort of bringing into the frame different moments within the story. And with that in mind, in the foreground, Jesus appears a second time. And in this case, he's being tended to by women that you can't find in the Bible anywhere. 2 midwives. Where what Duccio has done is to take contemporary 14th century social practice, medicinal practices, and incorporate that into his picture from the first century. Right? It illustrates, 1,300 years earlier. But he shows Christ being tended to in the way that babies in the 14th century in Italy would have been tended to, by midwives who assist the mother in birth, right? And they're nowhere to be found in the Bible, but they appear in a lot of literature that we find in the Middle Ages that are written for you, me, to use at home, to read in addition to the Bible, and augment the stories in ways that make it relevant to us. And the midwives appear there all the time. They also appear, we talked about religious plays that had the shepherds change from bad musicians to good musicians. We talked about that, right? Did we talk about that? Yes? No? Go over it again? Right? The shepherds on the right are carrying bagpipes. And they appear, not only do they appear in the Bible, but the idea of musical shepherds is something that appears regularly in Italian culture through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And that is in church plays, sometimes performed in the nave of the church, sometimes performed in the churchyard. Sometimes these religious plays performed in the streets. And they did the same thing that the Franciscan and Dominican sermons did, the same things that these devotional manuals did. They tried to sort of make the stories real, right? And they're staged, okay? The shepherds in some of these plays, when they're in the fields and the angel appears to them, they have musical instruments. And they're playing, but they're playing really, really, really badly, right? Off tune, squonk, squonk, with their bagpipes, right? Just making horrible noise. And then the angel says, hey, go see Jesus. And they say, what do you mean, or what? And it's explained to them that the Savior's been born, and all of a sudden they can play tune. And the change from atonal to tunefulness is meant to be a symbol for their conversion, brought into harmony, right? Okay, so now the midwives also appear in some of these productions and in some literature that appear around the nativity. That's, again, elaborate on the scene, things that we don't find in the Bible, but might help us to engage with it more directly. And so they're meant there as a symbol of the kind of things that you, women in the audience, would have seen if you were giving birth in the 14th century. Midwives shouldn't be there, right? Makes it relevant. In addition to this, the midwives and the story of the 2 midwives became a sort of a theme that got elaborated on to make the story more interesting. And by legend, one of the 2 midwives believed that this was the virgin birth, and the other one doubted. And the one who doubted decided to do an obstetric check for virginity. And her hand, this is again by legend, right? The hand withered up, right? Because of her lack of faith. And then Christ miraculously healed it, and she converted, right? She needed that proof. She's kind of like Thomas, who needed to stick his finger in the side of the risen Savior. Doubting Thomas needed to stick his finger in the side of the Savior to believe. So the midwife's kind of the same idea. It's basically the same story, but recast. Right? So there they are in the foreground. And Duccio does not seem to distinguish which is which, unbelieving versus believing. They're just at this point sort of doting over Jesus. Okay? So, again, realism, right, is the key element here. And as we're looking at this early stage of the Renaissance, the one thing from ancient Rome that's being reborn, right? Renaissance means rebirth. The one thing that's being reborn is an interest in realism. They're not looking at Roman body types big muscular dudes, right? They're not looking at Roman subject matter, ancient mythologies, right? Roman histories. They're just looking at the style. They're just looking at the realism. And that's the hallmark of early Renaissance, the early stages of Renaissance, Roman realism. Right? We looked at that on Friday as well. Now, Giotto had been in Florence. Duccio is working just south of that in Siena. And it's no accident that Florence and Siena are the two primary banking and mercantile centers, economic powerhouses in Italy at this time. Right? Rome, not so much. We'll talk more about that later today. Right? Venice hasn't really become a powerhouse yet. Milan, no. Siena and Florence share certain characteristics. Both of them having moved away from feudal control because of merchants and their economic capitalist success. Right? Money makes the man. Right? So your success within the social sphere, within the economic sphere, assures your status in society versus the old feudal system where you're born and stay a peasant for life. Right? So Siena shares that characteristic with Florence, and in fact, they were kind of rivals. More than kind of rivals, they actually had outright warfare at certain times in their history. Right? That kind of comes and goes. Okay? So Duccio is in a rival city. He worked in Florence for a little bit, where Giotto was, before sort of settling in Florence, or excuse me, settling in Siena. Right? And that remains his home. Okay? This is important for us because our picture at the National Gallery was part of a predella. Remember what a predella was? The narrative scenes that appear beneath the sort of the portraits of saints, right, on an altarpiece. This was part of a predella of a very, very, very large altarpiece, right? And this altarpiece was so big, it was for the high altar in the cathedral in Siena. So it's massive, right? The central panel that shows the Virgin Mary with Christ on her lap, the kind of the type that Giotto was doing, right? The type that our early Italo-Byzantine was, right? She's on a throne, she's got Jesus on her arm, she's pointing to him again, right? In this case, surrounded by angels and saints. This is 17 feet across and 11 feet tall. Right? It's huge. Would it fit in this room? Maybe, right? On this wall, if it were here. And the original composition had the front of it, right? The Virgin Mary, typical, normal to have her on the altarpiece, right? In addition to that, for the people of Siena, she was the patron saint of the city, right? She protected the city. She was the one they would pray to for protection. And in addition to that central panel, there was a predella down below, and you can see where ours originally was in this reconstruction. But there were also pinnacles up above that illustrated the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary. And it was painted on the back as well. So when the Mass wasn't being performed, you could walk around the back. And I don't know if they turned it around or not. It's awfully huge, right? A little bit too big to be moving around easily, right? So our centerpiece shows the Virgin Mary, the patron saint of Florence. There's that calligraphic line I was talking about on the edge of her robe again. And keep in mind that her robe is darker because of probably digital transfer issues, right? The photo that we have for the predella came from my photos. I took it there. I went home and played with Photoshop, remembering what it looked like right away. This is offloaded from the internet, right? So it's a good picture, but it could be better, right? So there she is, the patron saint of the city with Christ on her lap. And again, it's that, remember we talked about the Hodegatria type? The virgin who points the way to salvation. That came out of old Byzantine icons. Right? The Hodegatria type literally means the one who points the way to salvation. And again, same idea, hand under the hip, other hand coming across and sort of gently indicating, gently pointing your direction to him. Right? And surrounded by saints and angels, the saints are all saints who have local resonance in Siena. because this was a big deal, right? And we have actually, this is kind of a fascinating bit, right? For this particular work, we don't have all of these, but for this work, we've got the original contract between the city of Siena and Duccio. And it tells him specifically what to paint, and it tells him specifically how to paint it. He said you shouldn't use studio assistants. You should do it all yourself, right? And in fact, on the base of her throne, can you see beneath her feet there, there are some words. And it basically says, Duccio painted this. It's signed, which is kind of rare. And it said, please, Mary, look nicely on Siena. And look nicely on me, because I painted you so well. Right? And so he's doing it. It sounds kind of cocky, but in a way, you got to keep in the back of your mind that he's doing it as an act of worship. Right? He thinks that this act could conceivably help him as well. So that's on the base of her throne down below. Right? And our piece was originally below it. And just like Giotto's work that was cut up at some point in history, so too this one, right? Bits sold off to help finance something that needed financing, right? And we're lucky to get this one off the bottom of the front. Yeah?
Was it common for them to lose, I was reading and it said,
Common for them to
lose part of that, because there were 14 panels, and I was reading that upon disassembling it, that some of them were lost.
Oh, a few, and in fact, there you can see up at the top that some have been either trimmed down or lost, right? Look at our reconstruction on the right, and even what's left not being covered up. The centerpiece above her head was lost. That's a guess as to what it was. That's why it's grayed out. And some of the other pinnacles have been trimmed to be squares to make them more marketable as paintings rather than with the trapezoid top, right? Yes, it was very common for these to be cut up. Very, very common. It's the rare thing when you've got one of these multi-paneled Italian altarpieces with all of the parts intact, right? And it's not just Italy, it's elsewhere. We'll find multi-paneled altarpieces. And it's the rarity. It's not that rare, but it's more rare to have them intact. So if you go to the National Gallery and you wander through the Italian Renaissance galleries, the vast majority of pictures that you've seen are parts of other altarpieces into the 15th century as well, right? They're just been fragmented apart. And if you go to the National Gallery catalog that investigates these, there are the curators that research them, they'll usually tell you what other works of art are exactly the same size and we think go with this, right? Where, if we know where was it originally seen and in what context, right? That's the sort of thing we try to investigate as we find out the history of the picture, right? Because it makes a difference for us knowing that Duccio didn't just paint that nativity scene as a standalone work. He painted it to be seen in a sequence of works that gives us, here on the front, the infancy of Christ, right? Christ's youth. Up top, it's the life of the Virgin Mary. Flip it around on the back, we get Christ's adult life, and eventually his passion, right? So it's important to realize that as we're looking at this, that this was originally designed to be seen in a broader, sort of interdependent context. Right? Does that get it for you?
Yes,
Yeah.
wonderful, thank you.
Okay. So now back to the contract, right? We've got the contract for the work from the city, and it was the whole city that commissioned it, right? It was like the mayor's office, because she was the patron saint of the city, so they're going to fund this, right? And in addition to having the original contract, we also have an account from the annals of Sienese history that talk about the day that Duccio finished it. Right? It took 3 years. And according to this, history of Siena, which was written at the time, at the day that Duccio finished it, they declared it a city holiday. All the businesses were closed. Right? The only people that were working that day were people in the churches ringing the bells. Every bell in every church was rung as Duccio finished it. And they mounted a procession. So the city fathers, the priests of all of the different churches, all of the people went to Duccio's studio. And they carried it through the streets of Siena, all the way to the altar, with torches, singing, priests, censers, everything. They pulled out all the stops. This was so important to them, right? So if you think about the fact that we've got that little panel, this is really pretty much a coup, right? For the National Gallery to pick that up in 1937, right? It's one of the more high-profile works for being such a small thing. Yay, right? It's one of the more high-profile works and one of the more, if you will, important works in the collection because of this context, right? It's part of this. Now, the Maestà altarpiece. Maestà is the Middle Italian word, the Old Italian word for majesty. Maestà, you can see how that works out, right? It's the Virgin in majesty, the Virgin in glory, the Virgin in heaven, surrounded by saints, right? That's what that term means.
When you say it was sold off, approximately when?
That way, I don't know. I can tell you when we got it, right? That's very easy to find out. I don't have it on the top of my head. The general thing for them to be cut up and sold off is usually around the 17th, 18th century, right? For a couple of different reasons. One is that by the 17th century, as we'll see quite clearly, this style of art had sort of fallen out of favor, not as popular in Europe anymore. By the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, religion also becomes less important in many societies, and bills mount, and you figure out ways in which you can, do that and sell off a little, a farmer might sell off a little parcel of land in order to pay some bills, and this is kind of the same idea. You sell off some of the pictures, but we don't actually, no one wants to fess up to it. I'm the one who cut it up, right? We often do not have that, and because art dealers per se were not as regularized and normal of a practice as they became later, so they didn't keep records like they did in the late 19th century, for example. So, yeah.
Are there any sentiments in the art world that these pieces should be returned to Siena?
That's a good question. Yeah, the repatriation of art, right? I'm sure the people of Siena would love it, right? It's a question that comes up in certain times and places, but not everywhere. The issue that has been, okay, so try to keep this as focused as possible.
Sorry, I didn't derail.
No, it's all right. I don't mind getting derailed. I don't know if you noticed that already. But derailing is my middle name. I think it was like 1972. Don't quote me on the date. Museums got together and figured out sort of how our UNESCO laws going to apply to things museums own, right? Because prior to 1972, museums were kind of loosey-goosey when it came to sort of documenting where things had come from and whether or not they had been acquired ethically. Right? But after 1972, this became more codified. They sort of like standardized. Okay? And so there's always a question when a work of art comes to a museum is how did it get there and whether or not the person who sold it to the museum will have the right to actually sell it in the first place. Okay? And what they decided was that things before 72, you have to prove theft. Right? Something been lifted from an archaeological site or whatnot. And after that, right? So they've got a clean bill of sale on this one. And so there's ethical and there's legal, right? They're two different, those are not the same thing. It's ethical. Yeah. But once, if the National Gallery says, fine, we're going to try and get this back, that means somebody in Berlin's got to do the same thing, somebody up in New York's got to do the same thing, somebody over in Paris has got to do the same thing. And they're not. So they, okay, so you get this with one of the predella pieces. The entire predella is no longer there. The only thing that's in Siena Cathedral is that. The middle. The rest of it, all of them, 51 panels, right? A good 25 of them are all over the world. So they all have to get together and agree that they want to put it back together. Sometimes they'll do that for an exhibition, right? A loan exhibition, where you get things back together for the first time in hundreds of years. In the fall, there was a show of French works that were collected by American collectors. So the works were from the 18th century, and they were collected by Americans in the 19th century. And there was a pair of paintings that were commissioned originally by Madame Le Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV, right? And they were going to be put in her boudoir. And National Art owns one of them. The Metropolitan Museum of Art owns the other one. And they were side by side for the first time in 200 years. This fall, right? And that happens from time to time, right? Devotional works that have multiple panels get put back together for exhibition. But to get everybody to agree to put them back together forever is difficult. And it raises a huge issue. What happens if that becomes the norm and expected? Then what is the National Gallery left with? Works of art made by local DC artists. You know, eventually that's the kind of where the logic would lead. It's a bit extreme, but you know, all of our French works go back to France. All of our right? So I would love it if they could somehow figure out ways with many of these Predella pieces to mount an exhibition where you get the rest of them together, especially if these things we know where they all are. But it takes a lot of diplomacy, a lot of insurance money, and they're not cheap.
Well, but this would be so significant to the city.
Yeah, there hasn't been a demand yet, right? In the same way, and you may be aware of this, you may not. Okay, the Parthenon in Athens. You ever heard of the Parthenon? The Greek temple, the old 5th century BC Greek temple in Athens, right? In the early 18th century, I think it was early 18th, early 18th century, Athens had been colonized by the Brits, right? They were protector of the British Empire. And Lord Elgin, or Elgin, I've heard it pronounced both ways, took a bunch of the statues that had fallen off the Parthenon, laying around the base part, took them back to London, and they're still there, right? The Elgin marbles. And they are the prize of Greece, reflecting the single greatest period of Greek history. They really want them back, and they have a point in that they were kind of taken surreptitiously, right? They weren't bought, they were picked up and brought back during a period of colonization. But problems, right? It becomes a sticky wicket legally, right? And then there's the idea of legal precedent. So that's a bit of a longish answer, right? For Siena, I'm sure they would enjoy having these back. I've not heard of any pressure, right? I think part of that might come from the fact that these really, we're calling it proto-Renaissance on your worksheet, right? This really, really early stage of Renaissance. These are beautiful things, but they kind of get overshadowed. You know, it ain't no Michelangelo. So, right? And I don't want to qualitatively judge. I actually like this better than Michelangelo, for my opinion. But there you are, right? So it has to do with returns. There's been a lot in the news lately about things where they've proven that it was acquired illegally, and they've gone back. One example on this respect, which is much more recent, okay? The Nazis in the 30s started to close down Jewish-run businesses, many of whom were art dealers. A great number of really prominent, in Amsterdam especially, prominent Jewish art dealers. And there's this guy named Goudstigger, Adolf, maybe? Surprisingly, Goudstigger, had a fantastic collection of Dutch paintings that he was on market for sale. And as the Nazis invaded Amsterdam, he got on a boat to go to America, and they confiscated his collection. And he, on the way over, I laugh because it's so weird, but it's very sad. He was out taking some air at night on the hold. He slipped and he fell into the hold and broke his neck and died. Nazis took all of his works. They were in museums in Berlin for the longest time. And just 4 years ago, a lot of them got given back to the family. The families of these were taken. They had his inventory taken without permission. And the German museum said, "You're right. We shouldn't have them. They should go to you." And then they just turned around and sold them. And we got rid of them here. Which is kind of a funny story. Sad and funny. So money trumps everything. So that's a long answer, but it could be even longer. I'm not going to go there, right? Monuments Men, a movie with George Clooney from a couple years ago, is kind of all about trying to repatriate art as well that was taken by the Nazis. Okay. But continue with the idea of this thing being split up, right? It was painted on the back as well, and all the pinnacles up above and all the Predella down below has been split, right? Off to different museums. And the places where there's spaces, like the lower left corner, are things that we don't know what was there, right? It's just missing. And the only pieces that stay are the front and the back of the central part, right? So and you can see it's sort of an encyclopedia of images of the life of Christ. Kind of like Giotto's Arena Chapel, right? gives us in great detail all of these different stories from Christ's life. And just as we have one from the front, we also have one from the back, right? And I'm not going to bring it in, but you can go see it. We've got one of the predella pieces from the back where Christ tells the apostles, put your net on the other side, right? The miraculous draft of fishes. Right? So in splitting it up, not only were the predellas separated from the main panel, but the front panels were separated from the back as well. And they might have been separate panels. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't read the report. But sometimes we find that they're actually just sawn straight down the middle. So you get two pictures instead of one if it's painted on both sides. Right? So a lot of this is important for us because one of the things we learn in art history is how works of art have made it to us and what we're really looking at here. Right? Because when we look at works in a museum, we think about ourselves in a jewelry shop. And we're just looking at something beautiful, and we're not thinking about the fact that this was originally made with a very particular purpose in mind, right? To be seen in a particular context, right? Now, Duccio had a number of pupils, and because of the popularity of this work, right, the importance of this work for Siena, what we find when we look at Sienese art is that the next generation of artists after Duccio painted in a style that was very similar to Duccio's. And just as altarpieces tend to follow Byzantine icons because copies are better than originality, when Duccio's followers paint works of art that look like Duccio's, that makes them more valuable. Right? Look, it looks just like the altarpiece downtown, they could say. Right? So we've got this fairly beat up work. It's not in the best of shape, but it's quite lovely. Sorry about the typo. It's Simone. Working on my I got a new computer with like a 3200 by 1600 screen, so it's like, sometimes there should be an O in there and I'll fix that. Right? Simone Martini, the Angel of the Annunciation, has some of Duccio's slender elegance, porcelain beauty, lyricism of line are all to be seen here. Siena was also a major textile center, and you can see how much our artist is into the sort of the brocade pattern on that robe. And in fact, with a better detail behind the Virgin Mary, similar brocading to be seen there, right? So Simone is one of the followers of Duccio. And this small work, it's about like this, right? Wasn't made for public viewing. It was made for private devotion to be used at home by, you might imagine, someone with a fair amount of cash to burn, right? Simply imagine the cost of the gold leaf, the quality of the craftsmanship. See how elaborate the tooling is in the gold background around the frame, or even the three-dimensional quality of how that robe is handled, right? There's a relief to that as well. So the Angel of the Annunciation, this is the angel as he appears. I guess we say he. They usually look like men, right? But they're sexless, right? Genderless. The angel as it appears to the Virgin Mary to tell the Virgin Mary, announce to the Virgin Mary that she's going to be bearing Jesus, right? And this work of art is based on another work of art that Simone had done. Look at how similar the angel is. Look at how similar the Virgin Mary is in both of these. This is the other half of this diptych, right? So for the private devotion, this was part of a hinged work of art that would close over on itself like a book. And you would open it and you would hold it, and usually with maybe a piece of cloth on your hands as you're meditating, praying, right? And another work of art that's been cut to pieces. The one on the right, the Virgin Mary that goes with this. I mean, there's no doubt about it, right? We don't have any documentation, but it has a similar tool background, blah, 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 blah. Right, same size. It's in St. Petersburg, Russia, right? In the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. So I don't think they've ever been back together again. Going back to your question, it'd be nice, right? To bring them back together again just for a show or something. But I don't think that's ever happened. Now, as we look at the two of them, look at this altarpiece by Simone Martini that probably formed the basis for that. Okay? Somebody commissioned this little diptych for the private prayers, and we don't have the contract, but they probably asked for it to look like the more famous altarpiece. That would give it more value, make it more effective as an inspiration for prayer. And Duccio's Annunciation scene was commissioned by the city of Siena as well. In the cathedral, I'm going to draw something on the board here, right? Which is why you should not rely on recording, because you can't see what I'm doing, right? If this is the cathedral in Siena, here's the doorway, okay? And it's got side chapels here on either side, right? So it's like a badly drawn. And Duccio's Maestà, let's just say here, is the altar. And there would be Duccio's Maestà. And it's huge, right? And you can walk around the back of it and see all the scenes on the back when it wasn't very masterful. Behind here, there were a series of chapels. 4. Right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And after the Maestà was installed, the city went to 4 prominent artists in Siena, all of whom studied under Duccio, and said, we want an altarpiece to go with this. And since the subject matter of this one is the Madonna and Child, right? BVM and C. Blessed Virgin Mary and Christ. These were all scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary and the infancy of Christ. And this one, on the right, went here. The Annunciation, the beginning of the life of Christ. Okay? There's another one of Christ being presented in the temple. Okay? So that meant that just as Duccio's work here was really important to the city, so was Simone Martini's work there. And that would have inspired our guy over here to want something similar to that. This is the prestige of the original. Right? And when you copy that, that prestige rubs off, so to speak. Right? Where again, borrowing, copying, repeating became as valuable as or more valuable than originality. Right? Now, Simone Martini is for us a very important figure in the further history of art. Okay? As important as Duccio, as important as Giotto, but for a slightly different reason. I mean, he too is interested in the three-dimensional quality of things, trying to establish a realism there. I love in the Annunciation scene that they're on this marble slab, and you can even see the front edge of the marble slab, right? It comes over and drops down. There's a space there, a table for them to stand on, right? It's establishing three-dimensional space. Well, Simone is particularly important because in 1330, Simone Martini left Siena and he moved to France. Well, that's usually 1340, not 1330, 1340. Left Siena, moved to France, and he moved to the city of Avignon in France. And this is where he spent the rest of his career. And what that means is that works of art in this particular Duccio-inspired style, right? That's how he's working. When he goes to France, he takes and starts to work there in that same style. And because of Simone Martini, we see this Sienese style go international, right? He takes it with him to Avignon and begins to work there, and that spreads the style, almost single-handedly, right? The reason he goes there is the papacy. The popes in Rome have moved to Avignon. This is the papal schism. They moved there in 1305. They remained there till the 1370s, at which point they moved back And there was more than one pope. There was one still in Avignon and one back in Rome, right? And it didn't get resolved until 1430, right? The idea of the papal schism, the papal exile, okay? The final, I say 1418 here, but the final like talks that finally brought it to a close of 1435, right? So because the popes had recently moved to Avignon, that and set up a new court there, the papal court, right? That meant new buildings, new decorations, and all of the people around the pope, which included bankers, clerics, right? Who might want art for themselves. For successful artists like Simone Martini, this seems like a great opportunity, right? Avignon, go make your name. And what we see, since the popes from Italy have moved there, that a great number of Italian artists also moved to Avignon in the early part of the 14th century, hoping to pick up these crumbs, right? These commissions, fresco decorations, altar pieces, private devotional works. Right? Simone Martini is one of them. And we're not even sure if our little diptych might have been made in Avignon. We don't know for sure. Right? Siena seems more likely because of its closeness to our Annunciation scene here. Once Simone moves, 1340, takes this Duccio-inspired style and begins to practice it in France, it spreads from there. It spreads from there all over. And we refer to it as it spreads away from Siena. We refer to it as the International Gothic style because it's not really Renaissance yet in some people's minds. And the name is kind of stuck. Right. So what do you want to call it? The epicenter was Avignon. Simone Martini. And he trains artists there, and the papal court brought other dignitaries to court to visit it. They commissioned works of art in this new papal style, the International Gothic style. And we see it immediately spread from Avignon throughout all of France, Paris in particular. And from Paris, because of how European leaders are connected by blood, marriage, it spreads from Paris to what is today Belgium and Holland, the Low Countries. It spreads to Germany. It spreads to Portugal. It spreads to England. Right? But again, the epicenter is Simone Martini and Avignon. Right? The International Gothic style. And right around 1400, it's really international. Right? It's everywhere. This style that's derived from Siena. So this is, 100 years after Duccio, right? Around 1400 or so. It's up in Baltimore. WAM is Walters Art Museum, right? In my little abbreviation here. And there's the full Annunciation again, the same scene that we see on the right. Okay, so the angel's coming in and announcing to the Virgin Mary that she's going to bear Christ. And this was produced in the modern day, in the Low Countries, what is today Belgium and Holland, right on the border between the two. Maybe in Antwerp, we're not 100% sure. Actually, we are sure. We'll come back to that. We think it was certainly part of this region. We'll come back to that. So here's our angel coming in from the left. And again, that refinement and that daintiness that we saw in Duccio, right? Doesn't really look exactly like a Duccio, but you can see a certain lyricism to the handling of the drapery. Look at the Virgin Mary as it drapes over the arm of her throne. Look at the interest in brocading patterns, sort of sumptuousness, that cloth that's hanging behind the Virgin Mary. Again, the standard tooling of the background, right? And also in this case, look how bright the colors are, right? That's something that was in Duccio as well. Some of our slides showed it, some of them not so much, right? International Gothic style, derived from eventually Duccio via Simone Martini. Spreading first to Avignon, from there to Paris, and from Paris everywhere else, right? and even making it as far as the Low Countries. So the angel's coming in and saying the words. How do you make a picture seem to speak? Well, Giotto had those mouths open, remember? And they were breathing, you see her teeth. In this case, we got the words of the angel on a banner that the angel's carrying. In Latin, the words the angel says to the Virgin Mary, Ave gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Behold, full of grace, plena, gratia plena, right? Dominus, God, tecum, is with you. Right? That's the beginning of the message that the Virgin hears and is miraculously made pregnant with the infant Christ. And so we see up above, God in heaven, almost as if our gold background is a curtain, above that sky. And he is also speaking. You notice there's these rays coming out of his mouth. I think I have details coming up. And the rays are shooting down toward the Virgin Mary as well. And there's the dove of the Holy Spirit coming down, right, toward her. So it's all about auditory responses, right? She hears something and a physical change happens. The miracle happens. Let's take a look at these in detail, right? Some nice details of this. So there she is, again, that sort of porcelain refinement of her facial features that we can trace back to Duccio. The wonderful tooling of the gold background and the sumptuousness of the brocaded cloth behind her. We're seeing more and more details, like the architecture up above, becoming more detailed. That's typical of around 1400. As the International Gothic style spreads, it gets increasingly minuscule, almost microscopic in how the artist handles the different details. There's the angel's banner, which becomes decorative at the bottom, and the Virgin's book, which seems to be blowing the leaves. Well, we can see the words. And it reads down the left, Ecce, E-C-C-E, A-N-C-I-L, next line, I-A, Ecce Ancilla, right page, Domini. Those are the words that the Bible says that Mary said back. When the angel says, behold, full of grace, God is with you, she says, behold, the handmaiden of God. In other words, I'm here to do whatever he wants, right? Not handmaiden like the red robes and white hats that we saw this summer on Hulu, right? Not that kind. But rather, I am a handmaiden. I am here to do that which God wants me to. I'm a servant, right? Ecce Ancilla. Think ancillary. It's, right, the aid on the side. We have that word in English. Ecce Ancilla Domini. So those are her words coming back, even though her mouth isn't open. It's a way of handling this exchange of words that is the miracle itself, right? Up above, God's got a book. And again, we read them down the left page, then down the right page. Alpha, et, and then the Greek letter for omega, the beginning and the end. This is Jesus, right? As he's now gesturing to Mary, and you can see the lines coming from his mouth and basically toward her head. Yeah? Now, again, original context, right? This guy was part of a multi-paneled private use work, right? It's not an altar piece because it was not meant to decorate an altar. Each of the panels is about like this, right? Maybe a foot tall, maybe, right? And they were hinged for private devotion, and there were many panels that were hinged. There's at least 4 painted on both sides. So you could reparameter it in multiple ways, right? As it would fold open and shut. And so the Walters has 2 of them. So we have the Annunciation on the left that we're looking at here, and a crucifixion was hinged next to it. And we'll look at crucifixion scenes next, where again, God up above, Christ talking on a banner, the Virgin Mary, St. John on either side, angels around, which we'll look at. And these were then painted on the back, or excuse me, they were paired with other panels. These ones are the ones that were split away, that showed other scenes from the life of Christ. Right? So after the nativity, or excuse me, after the Annunciation, there's a nativity, and after the crucifixion, there's a resurrection. Right? All made for one person to use for private worship. Right? Personal private devotions. And each of these was also painted on the back. Right? And it's been split. So the Walters has 2, the other 2 are in Antwerp, at a small museum in Antwerp, where they don't let you take pictures. So I don't have good shots of that. If we look at the crucifixion scene, we can see it's really similar in style. We don't know who the artist is, right? But again, that Duccio-based elegance, refinement, stretched, attenuated figures, lyrical lines, bright, bright colors that derive eventually from Duccio via Simone Martini here 100 years later. In this case, Christ speaks the words that the Bible tells us that he speaks. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Sort of his last words on the cross. Not second to last words, right? I think the last words are, it is finished. Okay, very close to last words. And looking sort of forlorn. Again, the realism of the piece. He's blood on his head and a certain amount of human emotion to his face. Okay. On the cross itself, INRI with a little, it looks like the Spanish, what do you call that? Tilde, that you see in Spanish over Señor, right? Those are basically abbreviations in Renaissance script. So INRI is Latin Iesu, Christ, Nazarini, N, right? Christ or Jesus of Nazareth, R, Rex, King, I, Iudi of the Jews. Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. That's what the INRI stands for, right? And it goes back to the biblical verse that says that they pounded one of these mockingly over his head. Look at the King of the Jews, right? As part of his torment and torture. Now, God up above has a book that's opened as well. And you can see within that, I have to look this one up because I don't have this one as well memorized, right? I haven't been looking at my notes at all. What does it say on his book? Ego sum, I guess I can read that, right? Ego sum on the left, via viras, right? Behold, what is it? Again, I don't do Latin. Aren't you glad I don't read from my notes all the time? And then he did this, right? God's book says, I am the way and the truth, right? Ego sum via et veritas. Sorry about that. Via et veritas is what it refers to, and it's been abbreviated. I am the way and the truth. Those are Christ's own words as well, right? So these are what are supposed to remind us of how we should approach these different works in great devotion, right? It's supposed to inspire our prayers. We have, in addition to this, more of these jet rocket angels coming in, right? One of them leaving what appears to be a pretty good trail in the sky behind them. And you'll notice what they're doing. There are 3 of them, right? 2 on the left here. We see one more down below. It's a little hard to tell this because it's very badly worn, but maybe you can make it out here. Each one of them is carrying a chalice, right? A wine glass, right? That's been sort of just barely scratched into the gold background. Here, right? And then down below you can see maybe even a little bit better, even in this picture, because it overlaps with the cross. See what they're doing there? They're gathering the blood of Jesus, right? And for your prayers, of course, this is important because communion, which is part of the salvation process for Christians, the priest blesses the wine of the communion service, and it becomes the blood of Christ. It is the blood of Christ that makes us saved, right? So here we have this reference to the Mass, even though it was used in private, right? Remember the blood of Christ is shed for your salvation, right? And it's through the Mass ceremony that salvation is brought about, finalized, if you will, right? So each one of them is now gathering the blood. And you'll notice that our artist has also made a point of showing some of the wounds of Christ, right? His body is kind of beat up, right? Little flecks, bleeding, pretty much all over. And then looking at the Virgin on the left and John on the right. Well, it's the fourth angel. I missed it. Right? Virgin on the left and John on the right. Each one of them are again looking into the human emotions. Right? So again, that realism that was born with Giotto Duccio is still being passed on here. This comparison of the work in Baltimore and the work downtown shows you really what was International Gothic all about. Why do we talk about it this way? Look at how similar these two works are. One of them was produced, like I said, in the Low Countries, right? Modern Belgium, Holland. This one we know came from the city of Cologne in Germany, right? So it's not close. It's more than a day's trip. It's a couple days trip by land, right? Not today, but then. Right? Look at how similar they are. They both have those stretched bodies, right? Thin, dainty, attenuated bodies. They both have sort of the lyrical folds of the costume. They both have some of the same iconographical details, same subject matter details. Both have the same gold background. Other small refinements, right? God's missing from up above. No words coming out of Christ, even though we've got the letters on the back of the cross. Angels as well. And the angels here also gather the blood that drips from his hands and feet. Even though we have additional angels who are simply there to sort of add to it, right? So we have one on the left getting the blood from his hand, one on the right getting the blood from his hand, one on the left lower down getting the blood from the side, the wound in his ribs. And then finally one at the very bottom, taking it up from his feet. Right? So that same idea is here. And the same style is here. This is part of the reason we historians call this the International Gothic style. Right? Is because there's so much similarity in different regions in Europe. It's an international style. Now, same thing we saw before. There's the Virgin Mary. She almost always appears on this side. And by the way, the Annunciation almost always comes from that side too. Right? And I think it's because stage right was given priority. Right-handedness was seen as a sign of virtue. Left-handedness was seen as a sign of evil. Right? The word sinister comes from the Latin word for left. That's sinistra. So, people were born. Yeah, you would have had, if you, well, A, you wouldn't have been in school unless you were very well. Okay? But B, if you were, they would have bound your hand up, right, and made you write with your right hand. Because otherwise you'd be possessed. Right? So, the right-hand side is the favored side. Stage right. Okay? Not that John is in disfavor at all, but the Virgin has priority. Right? So that's why she gets to be on this side. And that's also probably why the angel comes in from this side in the Annunciation scenes as well. Right? It's coming in from the favored side. Okay? In this case, she's crying. You can make out there that she has tears. And John praying on the right. Now, in addition to the two primary characters and the angels that we talked about, we've also got two secondary characters kneeling and praying. Right? The one on the left goes back to, I don't know if somebody could find this out for me, how biblical this is. The legend of the centurion who pierced Christ's side. So Christ is hanging on the cross, right? Been hanging there for a while. And at one point, one of the Roman centurions, soldiers, took a lance and pierced his side. And the Bible says that water and blood flowed from Christ, right? That element of the biblical story became the basis for a legend around this Roman soldier, right? And the legend was that they gave him a name, Longinus, which is not even in the Bible, right? Saint Longinus. and that this Roman centurion was blind and didn't know what he was doing, was instructed to pierce the side of Christ, and by legend, again, not by Bible, but by legend, the blood ran down the lance, and he got it on his hands, and he wiped his eyes, and he could see. And on looking up and seeing Christ, he converts right away. Right? He recognizes the Savior. So we see him here post-conversion. Right? This is now the Roman soldier who has pierced Christ's side. We see the blood coming down all the way to the loincloth. Right? That little beating up on Christ's right hip of the blood. And there he is. And he kind of looks a little, his eyes are sort of half closed. Right? As part of this story. The guy on the other side, wearing white, is a monk. And he doesn't belong there. He's not part of the story. Right? By his white robes, we know that he's a monk from the Carthusian order. So he is probably the person who commissioned it. And this is something we see an awful lot in Renaissance art. Is if you commission the piece, you get really good seats, right? The artist will include you in the image, right? A portrait of you actually praying. And we'll see quite a few examples of where the donor, the patron, the money is actually included in the image. It might seem blasphemous to us today, right? He's done this sort of time travel, right? 1,400 years of time travel back to the foot of the cross. But as he's using this work for private, and again, this is it's about like yay, right? So it might have been in one of the chapels in the monastery. It might have been in his cell. It's just that the right size could be either place. But he would look at this and see himself. And it could be that he's not even a portrait, that he's meant to reach out to all of the Carthusians, all of the monks in the monastery who might have looked at this and think, that could be me. You make it generic enough, right? They all have the same shaved head, right? The tonsure with the ring of hair, right? What I'm ending up with anyway, without trying to shave it. Right? In the back, you had your hand up.
Didn't Scrivini have the same thing?
A bit louder.
Didn't Scrivini do the same thing? He had himself.
Indeed, I didn't show it to you, but you're absolutely right. So Enrico Scrivini in the Arena Chapel, right? He has all of these paintings on the walls on either side, and they kind of wrap around the altar. On the wall behind us, in that picture that was on PowerPoint, right? There's a Last Judgment scene. This is where Christ comes back at the end of time, and he welcomes the saved to him. They're on his right, and he casts the damned away from them. They're on his left. And that one, I think he's looking at the saved. Sometimes we see him doing this, right? So he's welcoming them, and right at the foot underneath him, there are angels holding like all of the things that were used to torture Christ at one point or another. And so there's an angel holding the cross. And kneeling beneath that is Enrico Scrivini, and he's holding up the church, right? He's got a little, and it looks like, right? It's the model of the church. He's holding it up saying, "Here, Jesus, please, welcome me along with all the," and he's right down here, right, on this side. So welcome me along with the other saved. In addition to that, the Giotto that's downtown, right? The Madonna and Child from downtown. Remember we looked at those other panels that probably went with it, and it had a predella down below? Directly beneath the Madonna and Child is a crucifixion scene, and kneeling at the foot of the cross in the crucifixion scene is a Franciscan monk, right? That makes us think that that was probably one of the altarpieces that Giotto painted for Santa Croce, the Franciscan church in Florence, where we knew he worked. Right? So that becomes a surrogate, right? That's a surrogate for you. Someone that as you're looking at this and using it in your devotions, you can imagine that you too might actually, through fervent devotion, have a vision, right? Have a sort of miraculous vision of this actually happening. Right? And you could actually be welcomed right there. Let's see. Interestingly enough, the Walters work with the 4 panels also came from a Carthusian monastery. And we know this based on the person for whom it was made. Right? A Carthusian monastery. So this work made for a particular Carthusian monk, maybe for one of the Carthusian monasteries in Europe. The Walters work on your right made for another Carthusian monastery in Europe. And we know this based on records of collections. We know that it was made for this monastery, which has since been mostly torn down. The Chartreuse, that means Carthusian monastery. Chartreuse de Champmont. It's just outside of the city of Dijon, right? Mustard capital, right? Grey Poupon, that stuff, right? Dijon, France. Okay. And in fact, I was there this summer. It's the third time I've been. It's really cool, kind of cool because the monastery's mostly been torn down. This building's still here, but heavily renovated. There's a tower just off the print that's still here. That's still here, right? Some of this wall is there, and some of these buildings are still there, right? And this probably went into this chapel. Okay. The rest of it has been turned into a hospital. It's actually an asylum, which is strange as a visiting place because sometimes you hear things, right? As you're visiting. I highly recommend it. A, Dijon is really cool, but B, this is terrific. This monastery was founded by the Duke of Burgundy, who was the little brother of the King of France, younger brother of the King of France. Okay, so 1360, the King of France, his name is Charles the Fifth of France, decides the country of France, as it's becoming cobbled together, is way too big for any one man to govern alone. And then he decides at that point that he's got these three little brothers. I'm going to give parts of France to each one of them to govern under me, run these sections, okay? So Philip the Bold is the oldest younger brother of the King of France. Next in line to the throne. Okay? And he gets the Duchy of Burgundy, which is where Dijon is. Okay? And Burgundy at that point in history wasn't just this little wine region that we know about today. It was huge. And Dijon was the capital. That's where Philip kept his palace. And he founds the Chartreuse de Champmont, this monastery, so that the monks would pray for him. Nice, huh? You know, Enrico Scriveni had the building. Philip's got a group of people praying for him in this monastery, a group of Carthusian monks. And in addition to that benefit, he was going to be buried there. This would be his burial site. And it would be the burial site not only for him, but for his son and his grandson and his great-grandson, the rest of his family, right? It would be the royal burial site, the ducal burial site for Philip's family, right? And again, he's the brother of the King of France. This helps the international Gothic style to spread around, right? It's through these marriages. So, based on the records of the things that were owned by the Chartreuse de Champmont, we know that this was one of them. Right? This belonged to Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, and was probably seen in his Carthusian monastery, the one that he paid for. Right? Now, it's 12:15. I got to stop. So, we'll pick up with this. We'll look more at other works of art from the Chartreuse de Champmont, and we'll look at other works of art done for the other brothers of the King of France, right? Because that's what helps this style to spread everywhere.